The sun hung mercilessly over Dodge City, Kansas, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where cattle drives had carved permanent scars into the earth. Samuel Lonely Mackenzie guided his weathered horse through the familiar chaos of the frontier town, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the saloons and general stores. At 43, his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. Dodge City in 1886 was a place where survival trumped sentiment, where the weak were forgotten and the strong rarely looked back. Samuel had learned this lesson the hard way, carrying the weight of choices that had cost him everything he once held dear. His ranch on the outskirts served as both sanctuary and prison, a place where he could tend his cattle and avoid the questioning looks of townsfolk who remembered the man he used to be. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." As he dismounted outside Henderson's general store, a small figure emerged from the shadows between buildings. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with dirt-streaked cheeks and clothes that had seen better seasons. But it was the eyes that stopped Samuel cold, intelligent, determined, and carrying a burden far too heavy for such young shoulders. "Mister!" the child called out, voice steady despite the obvious nervousness. "Are you the one they call Lonely Rancher?" Samuel paused, his hand still gripping the reins. Few people addressed him directly these days, and children usually scattered when he approached. "Depends who's asking." The child stepped closer, revealing features that could belong to either a boy or girl, androgynous in the way of youth, with hair cropped short and practical clothing that offered no clues. "My name's River. I got a question for you, and I need an honest answer." Something in the child's tone made Samuel turn fully around. River stood with the posture of someone accustomed to being dismissed, yet there was an underlying strength that commanded attention. "What kind of question?" River's hands fidgeted with a small, worn object, a wooden horse carved with obvious care but showing signs of constant handling. "Can you adopt me for just one day?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Samuel felt his chest tighten, memories threatening to surface that he'd spent years burying. Around them, the normal sounds of Dodge City continued. Horses neighing, men shouting, the distant piano from the Long Branch saloon. But in this moment, the world seemed to have narrowed to just the two of them. "That's not how adoption works, kid," Samuel said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "I know that," River replied quickly. "I'm not talking about legal papers or permanent arrangements. I just need someone to be my family for one day. Just one day, and then I'll disappear, and you'll never see me again." Samuel studied the child's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, he found only desperate honesty. "Why me? And why just one day?" River glanced around nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Because you understand what it's like to be alone, and because tomorrow is important to me. But I can't face it by myself." The simplicity of the request was what made it so unsettling. Samuel had encountered plenty of con artists and beggars in his time, but this felt different. There was no angle he could identify, no obvious benefit for the child beyond the strange comfort of temporary belonging. "Where are your real parents?" he asked. River's grip tightened on the wooden horse. "Gone. Have been for a while now. And you've been surviving on your own." "I manage." Samuel looked more closely at River's appearance. The clothes were clean despite being worn, and while thin, the child didn't appear malnourished. Someone was providing care, even if they weren't claiming parentage. "What happens tomorrow that's so important?" For the first time, River's composure cracked slightly. "I can't tell you that. Not yet. But I promise it's nothing illegal or dangerous. I need someone to stand with me. Someone who won't run when things get difficult." Samuel felt the familiar weight of his own past pressing down on him. He thought of another child years ago who had needed someone to stand with them. He thought of how his failure then had shaped every day since. "Kid, I'm not the man you think I am," he said quietly. "I'm not good at helping people. I'm better at letting them down." River stepped closer, and Samuel caught a glimpse of something unexpected in those young eyes, not just desperation, but a kind of wisdom that seemed far too mature. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person. Maybe someone who knows about letting people down is the only one who understands how important it is not to do it again. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He found himself studying River's face again, noting the careful way the child held themselves, the practiced manner of speaking that suggested experience with adult conversations. This wasn't just any orphaned street child. There was a story here, layers of complexity that he couldn't yet unravel. "One day," River repeated. "That's all I'm asking for. Tomorrow morning until tomorrow night. You don't have to take me home or change your life. Just be my family for those hours." Samuel looked around Dodge City, taking in the familiar sights that had become his world. The saloons where he was tolerated but not welcomed. The businesses where he conducted necessary transactions with minimal conversation. The church where he hadn't set foot since the day everything went wrong. It was a life of careful isolation, designed to prevent exactly this kind of complication. But something about River's request resonated with a part of him he'd thought was dead. Maybe it was the child's obvious courage in approaching a stranger with such a vulnerable ask. Maybe it was the way River stood there, clearly prepared for rejection but hoping anyway. Or maybe it was simply that Samuel recognized something of himself in this young person who had learned to navigate the world alone. What would this adoption involve? He heard himself asking. River's face lit up with the first genuine smile Samuel had seen. Nothing complicated, just be there. Let people see that I belong to someone, even if it's just for a day. Eat a meal together, maybe walk around town like we're actually family. And after tomorrow night, I disappear. You never see me again. It'll be like it never happened. Samuel studied River's face one more time, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate scheme. Instead, he found only hope and a kind of desperate trust that made his chest ache with familiar guilt. "All right," he said finally, the word escaping before he could reconsider. "One day, tomorrow. But I want to know what I'm getting into before then." River nodded eagerly. "Meet me at sunrise by the old oak tree on the hill overlooking town. I'll explain everything then." "Why not now?" River glanced around again, that nervous energy returning. "Because there are people watching, and they can't know about our arrangement until tomorrow. Trust me, it's better this way." Before Samuel could ask more questions, River turned and melted back into the shadows between buildings, leaving him standing alone with his horse and a growing sense that he'd just agreed to something far more complicated than a simple request for companionship. As he completed his business in town and rode back to his ranch, Samuel couldn't shake the image of River's face, the careful hope, the practiced independence, and underneath it all, a vulnerability that reminded him painfully of his own past failures. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional entanglement, and now he'd committed to a day that promised to upend his carefully constructed solitude. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge over the Kansas plains, Samuel found himself wondering what tomorrow would bring. River's request had awakened something in him that he'd thought was safely buried, a desire to matter to someone, to be the person who didn't let a child down when they needed help most. He thought about the wooden horse River had clutched so tightly, obviously a treasured possession. He thought about the way the child had spoken with such careful precision, as if every word had been rehearsed, and he thought about the promise that after one day, River would disappear forever. Something told him that promise, like everything else about this strange encounter, was more complicated than it appeared. Dawn broke over Dodge City with the kind of crisp clarity that made the Kansas sky seem infinite. Samuel had barely slept, his mind churning with questions about River's mysterious request. As he rode toward the old oak tree on the hill, he caught sight of the small figure already waiting, silhouetted against the morning light. River stood with the same careful posture as the day before, but in the softer light of sunrise, Samuel noticed details he'd missed. The child's clothes, while worn, were well mended with precise stitches. The boots, though scuffed, were of good quality leather. These weren't the possessions of a street orphan surviving on scraps. Someone with skill and resources had been caring for River. "You came?" River said, and Samuel heard genuine surprise in the voice. "I said I would." Samuel dismounted and studied River's face in the better light. "Now it's time for you to keep your end of the bargain. What's this really about?" River looked out over Dodge City, where smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys and the first stirrings of daily life were visible. "Today is the day I'm supposed to choose." "Choose what?" "My future." River's hand went to the wooden horse, that unconscious gesture Samuel was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "There are people down there who think they know what's best for me. They've made arrangements, signed papers, decided my fate without asking what I want." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of arrangements?" River turned to face him fully, and Samuel saw a maturity in those young eyes that spoke of experiences no child should have. "The kind that would take me far from here, to people who see me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood." "And you thought having a family for one day would change that?" "I thought it might give me the courage to speak up for myself." River's voice was quiet but steady. "Sometimes it's easier to be brave when you're not completely alone." Samuel studied River's face, noting the careful way the child avoided certain details. "Who are these people making arrangements for you?" "Prominent citizens. People who believe they're doing good." River's tone carried a bitterness that seemed far too sophisticated for someone so young. "They see a child without parents and assume that any solution is better than no solution." "But you're not actually an orphan, are you?" River's silence was answer enough. Samuel felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. "Your parents, they're alive but can't claim you publicly?" Another silence, but this time accompanied by a slight nod. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. In a place like Dodge City, there were countless reasons why a parent might be unable to openly acknowledge a child. Social scandal, legal, complications, dangerous enemies. The frontier was full of people running from pasts that could destroy them if exposed. "The wooden horse," Samuel said suddenly. "Someone made that for you. Someone who cares about you." River's grip tightened on the small carving. "My father made it, before everything went wrong." "Where is he now?" "Closer than you might think. Farther than I can reach." The cryptic answer frustrated Samuel, but he recognized the careful dance of someone protecting dangerous secrets. "And your mother?" Pain flashed across River's features. "Gone, really gone, not just hidden." Samuel felt his chest tighten with familiar grief. He thought of his own losses, the family he'd failed to protect, the reasons he'd chosen isolation over the risk of caring again. "So, your father is alive but can't acknowledge you, and these prominent citizens want to send you away to a boarding school back east. They think it's generous, giving an orphan an education and a chance at a respectable life." River's voice carried a note of desperation. "But if I leave Dodge City, I'll never see him again. He'll think I abandoned him the way everyone else has." Samuel began to understand the true weight of River's request. This wasn't just about having company for a difficult day. It was about having someone witness River's choice, someone who could testify that the child had family, had connections worth preserving. "Who's behind this boarding school plan?" River hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife. She's convinced the other ladies in her charitable circle that I'm a perfect project for their good works." Samuel knew Mrs. Abernathy by reputation, a woman who wielded social influence like a weapon, always certain of her own righteousness. If she'd decided River's fate, it would take considerable courage to oppose her. "And the meeting where you're supposed to choose, when is it?" "This afternoon, at the church. They've arranged for the boarding school representative to be there, along with half the town council." River's voice grew smaller. "They expect me to be grateful." Samuel looked down at Dodge City, imagining the scene River described. A child standing before a room full of adults, all convinced they knew what was best, all expecting compliance and gratitude. It was a scenario designed to overwhelm and intimidate. What do you want to happen instead? I want to tell them the truth, that I'm not an orphan, that I have family here, that sending me away would be cruel rather than kind. River met Samuel's eyes. But I need someone to stand with me when I say it. Someone they can't dismiss as easily as they would a child alone. Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. River, if your father is alive but can't acknowledge you publicly, revealing that truth might put him in danger? I know. River's voice was barely above a whisper. But living a lie is killing both of us. Maybe it's time to risk everything for the chance at something real. Samuel studied River's face, seeing echoes of his own past struggles with impossible choices. Tell me about your father. What's keeping him hidden? River looked out over the town again, and Samuel saw the child's careful composure beginning to crack. He's a good man who made one terrible mistake. The kind of mistake that follows you forever in a place like this. What kind of mistake? The kind that makes people see you as dangerous, even when you're not. The kind that makes them want you gone, even when you've paid for what you did. Samuel felt a chill of recognition. In Dodge City, there were plenty of men carrying the weight of past mistakes, some justified, some not. The frontier attracted people running from their histories, but it also had a long memory for certain kinds of transgressions. Your father, is he someone I might know? River's silence stretched long enough that Samuel thought the question wouldn't be answered. Then, quietly, you might have seen him around town. He works odd jobs, keeps to himself, tries not to draw attention. And you've been living separately to protect his secret? I've been staying with different families, helping with chores in exchange for room and board. People think I'm just another orphan making my way. River's voice carried a note of exhaustion. But I see him sometimes. We have signals, ways of letting each other know we're okay. Samuel began to piece together the full scope of River's situation. A child living in limbo, maintaining the fiction of being an orphan to protect a father who couldn't publicly claim them. The strain of such an arrangement would be enormous for both parent and child. River, what you're asking me to do, standing with you this afternoon, it could expose your father's secret. I know. But maybe it's time. Maybe hiding has hurt us more than the truth ever could. Samuel looked at River's face, seeing the same desperate courage he'd once felt when facing his own impossible choices. The child was asking him to be part of something that could change everything, or destroy what little family they had left. All right, he said finally. Tell me exactly what you need me to do. Relief flooded River's features. Just be there. When they ask about my family, I want to be able to point to you and say I'm not alone, that someone cares enough to stand with me. And if they ask questions about our relationship, tell them you're considering adoption, that you need time to make such an important decision properly. River's eyes met his. It won't be a lie. You are considering it, even if just for today. Samuel felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this strange arrangement was already changing him in ways he hadn't expected. What about your father? How will he react to seeing you with me? He'll understand. He knows I've been planning something. He just doesn't know what. As they walked down the hill toward town, Samuel found himself studying River with new eyes. The child moved with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations, always watching for reactions, always ready to adapt. It was a survival skill that spoke of months or years of living with dangerous secrets. River, he said as they reached the outskirts of Dodge City, whatever happens this afternoon, I want you to know something. You're braver than most adults I've known. Your father should be proud. River's step faltered slightly, and Samuel saw tears threatening. Thank you. That means more than you know. As they entered the town proper, Samuel noticed the way people looked at them. Curious glances, whispered conversations, the kind of attention that came when something unexpected disrupted the normal patterns of daily life. Word would spread quickly that lonely rancher had been seen with a child, and by afternoon, half the town would be speculating about their relationship, which, Samuel realized, was exactly what River had been counting on. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Dodge City's small church, as townspeople filed in for what Mrs. Abernathy had announced as a charitable presentation. Samuel sat in the back pew with River beside him, both of them watching as the church filled with curious residents and self-appointed community leaders. Mrs. Abernathy stood at the front, her steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression of righteous determination. Beside her sat a thin man in an expensive Eastern suit, clearly the boarding school representative who had traveled from back east to collect his new student. "Before we begin," Mrs. Abernathy announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I want to thank everyone for coming to witness this wonderful opportunity we're providing for young River here." Samuel felt River tense beside him. The child's hand gripped the wooden horse so tightly that Samuel worried it might break. "As you all know," Mrs. Abernathy continued, "River has been without family for some time now, surviving on the charity of various households. Today, we're pleased to announce that the Whitmore Academy for Disadvantaged Youth has agreed to provide a full scholarship, including transportation to Boston and all necessary expenses." Murmurs of approval rippled through the congregation. Samuel recognized the faces around him: shopkeepers, ranchers, saloon owners, and their wives. Good people mostly, but people who saw charity as something done to others rather than with them. "River," Mrs. Abernathy called out, "would you please come forward so everyone can see the child we're helping?" River stood slowly, and Samuel felt every eye in the church turn toward them. He rose as well, placing a gentle hand on River's shoulder in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. "Actually," River said, voice carrying clearly through the church, "before we talk about my future, I think everyone should know the truth about my present." Mrs. Abernathy's smile faltered. "What do you mean, dear?" River walked toward the front of the church with Samuel following. "I mean that I'm not the orphan you think I am. I have family here in Dodge City, family that cares about me and wants me to stay." The murmur that went through the crowd was different now. Surprised, confused, with an undercurrent of something that might have been disapproval. "River," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "we've discussed this. Wishful thinking about absent relatives doesn't constitute family." "I'm not talking about wishful thinking," River replied, turning to face the congregation. "I'm talking about my father, who has been watching over me from a distance because he thought it was safer for both of us if people didn't know the truth." Samuel felt his heart rate increase as he realized what River was about to do. Around the church, he could see people leaning forward, hungry for whatever revelation was coming. "And who exactly is this mysterious father?" Mrs. Abernathy demanded. River looked directly at Samuel, and for a moment, he thought the child was going to claim him as the parent. Instead, River's gaze moved past him to the back of the church, where a figure had quietly entered during the commotion. "His name is Thomas River," River said clearly, "and he's standing right there." Samuel turned to see a man in his late 30s, dressed in the simple clothes of a laborer but carrying himself with quiet dignity. The resemblance to River was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The same intelligent eyes, the same careful way of holding oneself, the same underlying strength. The reaction in the church was immediate and dramatic. Several people gasped, others whispered urgently to their neighbors, and Samuel saw more than one face harden with recognition and old anger. Thomas River walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes fixed on his child. "Hello, River," he said softly. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to stand with you." Mrs. Abernathy's face had gone pale, then flushed red. "Thomas River," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I should have known. This explains everything." Samuel felt the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way people drew back slightly, the way conversations stopped and started again in hushed tones. Whatever Thomas River had done in his past, it was something the town remembered and hadn't forgiven. "What it explains," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the obvious hostility, "is why my child has been living apart from me. I thought I was protecting River by staying away. I thought people would be kinder to an orphan than to my child. And you were right, Mrs. Abernathy snapped. Your presence here only confirms that sending River away is the best possible outcome. The child deserves a chance at a respectable life, away from the shadow of your reputation. Samuel saw River's face crumple slightly at the harsh words, and something inside him snapped. He stepped forward, placing himself between the Abernathys of the world and this small family trying to find their way back to each other. With respect, Mrs. Abernathy, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded respect in this town, I don't think you're in a position to decide what's best for River. And what position are you in, Samuel Mackenzie? Mrs. Abernathy shot back. You've barely spoken to another human being in 3 years. What makes you think you understand anything about family? The words hit their mark, but Samuel didn't flinch. Maybe that's exactly what makes me understand. Maybe someone who's lost family knows how precious it is when you find it again. He turned to address the entire congregation. I've spent the last day with River, and I can tell you that this child has more courage, more integrity, and more love than most adults I've known. River doesn't need to be saved from family. River needs family to be saved. Thomas River stepped forward, his eyes meeting Samuel's with gratitude and something that might have been hope. Mr. Mackenzie is right. I've made mistakes. Serious ones. But I've paid for them. And I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of my child's love. What mistakes? Called out someone from the crowd. Tell us what you did, Thomas River. That was so bad you had to abandon your own child. Samuel saw Thomas flinch, saw River move closer to their father's side. This was the moment of truth, the revelation that could either set them free or destroy them completely. Thomas took a deep breath, his hand finding River's shoulder. 5 years ago, I killed a man. The church erupted in gasps and urgent whispers. Samuel felt his own shock, though he tried not to show it. Beside him, River stood straighter, as if prepared to defend their father against the world. It was self-defense, Thomas continued, his voice cutting through the noise. The man was drunk, violent, and he was attacking a woman outside the saloon. I tried to stop him, and he came at me with a knife. In the struggle, he fell and hit his head. The law cleared you, someone called out. Samuel recognized the voice of Judge Morrison, one of the few people in town whose opinion carried real weight. The law cleared me, Thomas agreed, but the town didn't. The man I killed had friends, family, people who believed I was a murderer who got away with it. They made it clear that my presence here was unwelcome, that my child would suffer for my actions. Mrs. Abernathy seized on this. Exactly, which is why River needs to leave, to start fresh somewhere else. No, River said, voice ringing with conviction. I need to stay here with my father, in the place we both call home. I need people to see that we're not defined by one terrible night, that we're more than the worst thing that ever happened to us. Samuel looked around the church, seeing the faces of people wrestling with their own consciences. Some still looked hostile, but others seemed to be reconsidering, seeing Thomas and River not as problems to be solved, but as people deserving of compassion. I have a proposal, Samuel said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him that he'd thought was dead. Instead of sending River away, what if we gave this family a chance to heal here, in their home? What if we showed them the same mercy we'd want for ourselves? And what role would you play in this arrangement? Mrs. Abernathy asked suspiciously. Samuel looked at River, then at Thomas, seeing the hope and fear warring in both their faces. I'd like to help. Maybe River could stay at my ranch sometimes, help with the cattle, learn some skills. Maybe Thomas could work for me, earn an honest living while rebuilding his reputation. You're talking about adopting them both, someone called out. I'm talking about being family, Samuel replied. The kind of family that doesn't abandon each other when things get difficult. River's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than despair. Thomas River looked at Samuel with an expression of profound gratitude. This is highly irregular, Mrs. Abernathy protested. The boarding school representative has come all this way. The boarding school representative, said the thin man in the expensive suit, speaking for the first time. "Can see that this child has family after all. We don't separate children from loving parents, Mrs. Abernathy. That would defeat the entire purpose of our mission." Samuel saw Mrs. Abernathy's face flush with embarrassment and anger, but she was outnumbered now. Around the church, he could see people nodding, some even smiling at the unexpected turn of events. Judge Morrison stood up from his pew. "I think we've heard enough. Thomas River was cleared of any wrongdoing 5 years ago, and it's time this town stopped punishing him for defending an innocent woman. As for River, any child brave enough to stand up for their family deserves our respect, not our pity." The crowd murmured agreement, and Samuel felt something shift in the atmosphere of the church. What had begun as a meeting to send River away had become something else entirely, a moment of community reckoning, a chance for healing and redemption. As people began to file out of the church, many stopped to speak with Thomas and River, offering words of support or simply acknowledging them as neighbors rather than outcasts. Samuel watched the small family embrace, finally free to be together without hiding. "Mr. Mackenzie," River said, turning to him with shining eyes, "thank you for standing with us." "Thank you for teaching me what family really means," Samuel replied, and meant every word. 3 months later, Samuel Mackenzie stood on his porch watching the sun set over his ranch, but the view had changed dramatically. Where once there had been only cattle and endless solitude, now there were signs of life everywhere. A vegetable garden River had insisted on planting, a workshop where Thomas crafted furniture and toys in his spare time, and the sound of laughter that had become as familiar as the wind across the plains. River burst around the corner of the house, chasing one of the barn cats with the kind of carefree energy that spoke of a child finally allowed to be a child. The transformation over the past months had been remarkable. The careful, guarded demeanor had given way to genuine happiness, though the underlying intelligence and strength remained. "Samuel!" River called out, using the informal address that had developed naturally over their time together. "Come see what Papa finished." Samuel smiled at the easy use of Papa, a term that had taken Thomas weeks to accept. So accustomed had he become to hiding his parental role. Now, watching father and child, together it was impossible to imagine them as anything but family. In the workshop, Thomas was putting the finishing touches on a rocking chair, his skilled hands moving with the precision of someone who had found his calling. The work had been good for him, not just the income, but the sense of purpose and the respect he'd gradually earned from customers who appreciated quality craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," Samuel said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Who's it for?" "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas replied, pride evident in his voice. "Her first grandchild is due next month." Samuel nodded, remembering when Mrs. Henderson had first approached Thomas about the commission. It had been a significant moment, one of the town's most respected citizens publicly choosing to do business with the man many had once shunned. Word had spread quickly, and soon Thomas had more work than he could handle. "The whole town's talking about the church dedication next week," River said, settling cross-legged on the workshop floor. "Are you nervous about speaking, Samuel?" Samuel felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. When Reverend Matthews had asked him to speak at the dedication of the church's new community hall, built with donations that had poured in after that transformative afternoon 3 months ago, he'd almost declined. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the weight of representing, the changes in Dodge City felt enormous. "A little," he admitted, "but I think it's important to acknowledge how much we've all learned." The community hall had been River's idea, born from a simple observation that Dodge City needed a place where people could gather for reasons other than drinking or conducting business. The child had presented the proposal to the town council with the same courage they'd shown in the church, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Thomas looked up from his work. "You know, when I first came to this town, I thought I'd never belong anywhere again. I thought my mistake would follow me forever, defining everything I did. And now?" Samuel asked. "Now I realize that mistakes don't have to be endings. Sometimes they're just difficult beginnings." Thomas set down his tools and looked at his child with obvious love. River taught me that. This brave kid who refused to accept that we had to live in the shadows forever. River blushed at the praise but didn't deny it. Over the months, Samuel had watched the child grow into their role as a bridge between different parts of the community, equally comfortable talking with the banker's wife about charity work or helping the saloon keeper organize a town cleanup day. "Samuel," River said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That first day, when I asked you to adopt me for just one day, did you know it would turn into this?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I thought I was agreeing to help a child through one difficult afternoon. I had no idea it would change all our lives. Are you glad it did?" Samuel looked around the workshop, taking in the evidence of their unconventional family, Thomas's tools, River's drawings pinned to the walls, the comfortable chaos of people who had learned to live together. "I can't imagine my life any other way now." The next week, as Samuel stood before a packed community hall, he looked out at faces that had become familiar over the months. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front row, her expression no longer hostile but merely reserved. She'd never fully embraced the changes in town, but she'd stopped actively opposing them. Judge Morrison smiled encouragingly from his seat, and Thomas and River sat together in the middle section, both beaming with pride. "When I first came to Dodge City," Samuel began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "I thought I was looking for a place to hide from my past. I thought the best I could hope for was to be left alone with my regrets." He paused, finding River's eyes in the crowd. "Then a child taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. That sometimes admitting you need family is the first step toward finding it." The crowd was silent, attentive in a way that surprised Samuel. He'd expected polite tolerance, but what he saw was genuine engagement. "This community hall represents something important," he continued. "It's a place where we can come together not because we have to, but because we choose to. It's a place where we can be honest about our struggles and celebrate our victories together." He looked at Thomas, remembering the man's courage in revealing his past to a hostile crowd. "We've learned that redemption isn't something you earn in isolation. It's something that happens in community, when people choose to see your potential rather than just your mistakes." The applause that followed was warm and sustained. As people filed out of the hall afterward, many stopped to speak with Samuel, Thomas, and River, not as curiosities or charity cases, but as valued members of the community. Later that evening, as the three of them sat on the ranch porch watching the stars emerge, River broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about that wooden horse," the child said, pulling the carved toy from a pocket. "Papa made it for me when I was little, before everything went wrong. I used to think it was just a reminder of better times. And now?" Thomas asked gently. "Now I think it was a promise that no matter how dark things got, there would always be something beautiful to hold on to." River looked at both men with eyes that held wisdom far beyond their years, and that sometimes if you're brave enough to ask for help, you might find that you're not as alone as you thought. Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "River, what you did that day in town, approaching a stranger and asking for family, that took more courage than anything I've ever done." "It wasn't courage," River replied quietly. "It was hope. Hope that somewhere in this world, there were people who would choose love over fear, who would choose to build something beautiful instead of just protecting what they already had." Thomas reached over and ruffled his child's hair. "And you were right. You found Samuel, and Samuel found us, and somehow we all found our way home." As the night deepened around them, Samuel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A child's desperate request had become a family's salvation, a community's awakening, and his own redemption. The lonely rancher who had once believed his story was over had discovered that sometimes the most important chapters are the ones you never see coming. In the distance, the lights of Dodge City twinkled like earthbound stars, and Samuel knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort, love over fear. But tonight, Sitting with his chosen family under the vast Kansas sky, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. River had asked for adoption for just one day, but what they'd all received was something far more precious, the chance to adopt each other for a lifetime, to create a family bound not by blood or law, but by the conscious choice to stand together against whatever the world might bring. And in the end, Samuel thought, that was the most beautiful kind of family of all. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.